G'day friends and fans, welcome to Dave Talk Stuff. As part of my deep dive into 5 questions women avoid about men's rights, we've reached question 4. Why do we have male educational unachievement and how do we fix it? Because once upon a time, men were high achievers. So what is throttling men? Why the shift? I think many know straight away the shift starts with a cognitive bias against men amongst female teachers, a bias that has to be addressed at the state and federal level in every Western country, like all bias in most countries. If a teacher is biased against a student, they are dismissed. First, temporary re-education is required. To sensitivity training, that's what re-education is. It's a force the communists into their own, use the communists' own tactics against them, and you'll watch communism die. Once they suffer the consequences of communism, they stop being communist. You have to stop putting up with systemic abuse against men. And then boys are overrepresented amongst low performers in literacy and numeracy. That's where it starts. Reading, writing, and arithmetic. Because those are not the core focuses of school. Boys spend way too much time in playtime, so they don't learn to focus, they don't learn discipline, and this is at an early age where instead of just sitting around with your ABCs, you're watching puppet shows and you're getting... It's not bad to have someone come in and read to you, but at some point, this is the problem. They create dependency by having the students all watch the TV or all watch the reading or listen to the teacher talk about violence against women and minorities and people of color and other people and women and children, and they are passively aggressive, committing violence against boys by denying them, constantly making them sit down, constantly making them break the stereotypes of boys by making them play with things they don't want to play with, by making them read books they don't want to read, by making them do boring recitation of songs and poetry instead of the basics. Now, factors include slower early brain development, according to teachers. However, if you introduce boys to male teachers, they start to improve straight away. Now, there's underrepresentation of male teachers, 16% in primary schools across the West. If that was women, you'd hear nothing but non-stop complaining. Men have got to learn to speak up and act out in a positive manner, to make politicians be aware that you are losing votes. Yes, I am well aware the establishment is focused on women on both sides. Now, the educational environment is mismatched. It's structured for explicit learning activities that are geared towards girls, where girls get extra special attention each and every subject, each and every time. This is why teachers want less students in the classroom, so they can focus on the child that they claim it's so they can focus on the child left behind. No child left behind policy has produced more, not less. So, first step is to undo every DEI, affirmative action, gender policy across the board. And then how do you address girls? Well, that's simple. Now, it's not proven beyond a reasonable doubt that girls and boys should have their own special classes. Right? If they are going to give yet you see where girls are given more attention. So you let the women have their women's only classes, and you let the boys have their own boys only classes. And if you have struggling students, you put them in the struggling student class, whether they be boys or girls. And if you have excellent students, you put them in the excelling students class, whether they be boys or girls. See, the problem is the disruptive students drag the whole class down, and the excellent students keep getting ahead of the teacher, and most teachers can't handle that when the student is smarter than the teacher. As you can see by the abuse that led to the creation of Ted Zelinsky. No, I'm not joking. Ted Zelinsky has been finally identified that he is the product of systemic abuse against a younger student who was incapable. He was, and we don't know how many others in his class or others like him. We only know about Ted Zelinsky. He was a genius, 167, who had many ideas the teachers did not like, so instead they introduced him to Nietzsche and Marxism, deconstructed every idea he had, mocked and ridiculed him, even though he was right and they were wrong. They systematically targeted him, broke him down, and when he was no longer functional, they kicked him out of school. They deliberately created a monster just because he challenged their ideas, and they couldn't handle it. They couldn't handle being wrong, so they kicked him out. But first they destroyed him. They created a program to deliberately destroy him. Deliberately targeted him. But so it wouldn't like they targeted him. They got him into a program. 70 students was whittled down to 22. But the systemic abuse was only leveled at him. Everyone else was just playful banter. A little healthy debate. To challenge their ideas. To get them to defend ideas. Ted, they broke down. They mocked and ridiculed every belief he held. No matter what he came up with, they would counter-argument. And that's how they developed all these Marxist counter-arguments that you see online all the time. These were developed in Harvard to attack capitalism, but Ted Zelinsky was the individual they systemically abused, believing that So whenever you hear about Harvard, remember, they create monsters. And they hate and they attack boys. White boys. And of course, as you know, shortly after Ted Zelinsky went through Harvard, they went from being a white boy majority to a white boy minority to or less than, we're going to represent the globe. Well, India doesn't, China doesn't, and yet they're the ones complaining. They're the ones who come here for our education, but they don't better their country and they don't better ours. The majority of education doesn't benefit the recipient. It's not just primary school, but we could get in a primary school. We can start addressing the problem. The core problem with education is the teachers are institutionalized. They have no consequences. They have little to no, particularly at higher levels, incentive to do the right thing. The state won't prosecute them because they hide behind free speech while they take away yours. It's totally abused. And it starts by getting rid of the fact that 16% of primary teachers are male. Bring that back up. Most of the workforce is losing male representation, except for the most dangerous jobs, because women and workplaces will replace you with robots, and AI, they keep the women because the women can form groups and sue them. Even when there's representation of over 50%, women keep pushing for more women in the workplace. And there's no pushback in society because women do not mean equality. They mean power. Or equity of outcome. They mean dragging everyone down to the lowest common denominator. Education is mismatched. Boys perform better with high structure, clear objectives, proper feedback, and removal of what's called the girls-based approach. Girls-based approach is where there's focus on the arts. Now, the arts is a human right and a human need. But as far as I'm concerned, if the majority of your primary school is spent on the arts, you're not learning. And another thing, reduce the burden. Kids don't need to learn things they're not going to use. That's a fundamental fact that we're teaching them stuff they will never use and will never remember. You can make them aware of minor subjects, but making them focus on it's gone from 10 to 13 to I think 16 subjects. And when they get to university, they don't know what to pick, they don't know what they want, and then they get totally mismatched most of the time by their test scores. When the tests, again, to stuff they learn the tests, they don't learn how to think, they learn the tests. Why? Because they're all focused on no child left behind. So they create all these artificial tests to give these kids artificial scores. And when they get to university with their artificial scores, they have to spend the whole year. That's why most courses are 4 years. Because they can spend most of the time educating the child. Because most of the time they're not getting a young adult, they're getting a child. And again, that's systemic abuse of both men and women at this stage. Cultural influences. We have to outlaw cultural Marxism. Have to do away with the systemic abuse. And this takes minds, not a single mind like Ted Zelinsky, but Ted Zelinsky started something. And we don't know what because it's all outlawed, all hidden away by the FBI. But he was saying technology would destroy society. Now, we do not know exactly to what extent or how, or what the core issues and fundamental things that he started to identify. But we do know many millionaires and billionaires no longer allow their children to have mobile phones or tablets, or they limit them. They limit the amount of AI and robotics in their houses. While they now, and of course, as you know, millionaires and billionaires have special education for their children to give them a fundamental edge against you. But we're also going to deal with peer pressure. Peer pressure and social norms to deconstruct masculinity must be seen as a form of abuse. There also must be the stop of acceptance of the school bully, particularly when it's the sporting focus. Here's the secondary. The secondary problem is the focus on turning boys into sports stars to satisfy female lust, and this is the other form of systemic abuse that goes on in school, is the hypersexualization of boys as perform physical machines, not as individuals with rights. So boys spend a lot of time practicing sports, getting told how they can make lots of money. Again, this is systemically created. It's an artificial economy that's been propped up over time with government money. If sports teams had to buy their own stadiums, pay the proper amount of taxes, didn't have subsidies, you wouldn't have lots of money being paid to sports stars. Now, Joe Namath kicked it off, starting there. He argued successfully and based on the figures at the time, it did look like teams could afford to pay their quarterbacks $1 million. They were making lots of money off the backs of these, off the backs. But again, a lot of that was because everything was so cheap and geared towards teams getting sporting teams getting an unfair advantage. And for some reason, television paying lots of money. I mean, lots of money was put into advertising, into television. Again, this money came from political parties, so it was all fundraised off the back of the taxpayer. And this was all to buy political and cultural influences. So you can start to understand there's a bias in society that produces poor outcomes for boys. Now, I can tell you that's because they want to produce soldiers and factory workers only, and not doctors or lawyers. But the West does have a fetish fascination with the arts. Yet when a male artist does come along, as you've said, they're abused and mishandled and not even encouraged. It's, oh, you do it, yes. And you see this with the worship of the gynocentric singers. Once upon a time, males dominated singing, and they sung about a large variety of subjects, but more and more it became only about relationships and breakups, and pretty much as you saw the result. And then, of course, it became all about the crime and the money. And again, you see the result. Again, if you see how the money is spent and focused, again, it's artificial. So the potential solutions and interventions: male teachers, structured teaching, starting school instead of at 7, right? No preschool, nothing. No. You introduce a parenting program to all parents, teach your children of 3 basics, and then they start school 1 to 7, and then high school. So 1 to 6, so only 12 years of education, 1 to 6, right? A total of 18 years of education, so, but only 12 of those are spent in school. So you have 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. And they start university a year later. And that is limited to 3 years, except for doctors who spend 3 years of theory, 3 years of practice, and then 3 years of supervised practice. But, again, the standards for doctors and engineers and maybe we should look at lawyers, but there needs to be standards. But these are clear standards, not subjective standards based on quotas and races. And so we have to get representation has to go, except for guaranteeing that 50% of the population, the majority of the population, get the majority of the jobs. And we stop mass migration. Okay? We stop migration and politicizing education as a tool of political influence. And because, as you see, do-gooders get into position of trade and turn education programs from training teachers to go to the third world, to educate the third world, into importing the third world and replacing the local population with the third world. Because systemic abuse. And no, we all know that it's cultural Marxism. So we have to identify cultural Marxism in a definitive legal form and ban it. That's gender-based bias. That is the oppression of men, the laws around protected classes, a ban on social media controlling speech. Okay, if it's legal, it's on social media. If there are restrictions like age, those are identifiable legal issues already resolved. Social media is rewriting our laws as we speak because they're pushing a new form of society on us through social media manipulation, controlling who you hear and when you see them. Once you understand the algorithms are geared against you, this is why more and more people are shifting to alternative platforms. Social economic pressures. The working class have always been disadvantaged, and that is particularly single homes, whether it be mother or father, and that is simply because we do not get secondary education. We can fix this. It'll take time and money, but no one wants to do this. We turn social media against them to turn social media into classrooms. But we can do this. There are already education tutorial platforms. But there's nothing stopping. If we could raise $1 million, hire a few male teachers, and get this going, there seems to be no male teacher willing to do this. They've got to be hired. They've got to be structured. They've got to be guided. Now, there are some educational videos out there, but I think we got to start addressing the issues. I can't break through to men's rights groups. That's another problem. The global phenomenon is don't fix it, especially in high income countries. If we fix problems, politicians have no use to society, and that's not a bad thing, don't you think? How would you like to see half your politicians hasta la visted? No more representation for the illegals. No more representation based on the number of hotels filled with foreigners on the high holiday weekend, which just happens to coincide with the census. No, census should be, And you know this to be true in many places and many situations. And if anyone doesn't know what the high holidays are, let me just check the definition because I'm not sure which is the exact list. These are the majority of Jews consider holy months. So this is September, October, December, sometimes, yeah. So, yeah, you don't realise how... now again, there is no evidence to say that Christianity in the school taught morals. Right and wrong can be taught, morality can be taught, but if it's religious-based, you do create a bias. We have to avoid creating bias, and for or against anything other than good behaviour. Because the fundamentals of Christ did not teach to force, right? He said, and I'm paraphrasing, go forth and multiply. He didn't say how. He said, right? He told his followers, who were predominantly men, to go forth and multiply. That means, and it's understood back then what it meant. You taught your wife to be a Christian. You taught your children to be Christian. It was the signing over of right. It was creating institutions controlled by others that allowed others to control us. So while addressing the underachievement of boys, no one's saying that we're not taking anything away from girls' education. This is not a zero-sum situation. You can improve boys' lot in life without diminishing girls. The girls can still have their special classes, but the boys, instead of being out in playtime or sporting, whatever, it's equal education for all. So boys have boys-only classes and boys-only teachers for at least half their classes. And the same with girls, right? And we get rid of the imbalance focused on sports and the imbalanced focus on... Now, yeah, you might say, oh, but then we won't win Olympic gold, and we won't do this, and we won't do that. And that's the problem, isn't it? They want to focus society into narrow outcomes. Then, okay, you can start to tailor the program and say, okay, if this clod or this achiever is naturally sporty, then we can carve out sporting exemptions, or if people are particularly good singers. But the state has to stop monopolising everything into one size solution fits everyone. And why do they do this? So they can pay themselves more money, so they can spend more money on frivolous things that get a lot of attention and a lot of sympathy. Right? When we outlaw pork barreling spending, that's when you really get to the heart of the problem and solve most of society's problems. Again, the West has that attitude of don't solve, don't fix, don't address the issues. You politicise them, assign blame, run the election, and then spend the next 4 years calling each other names. And that's the fundamental business model of government under Marxism. There is no debate. There's no high IQ politician who eloquently debates the issues. I think the last debater we really had, and he lost, by the way, by a long shot, was Nixon and JFK. Both won in their respective political theatres, but by a long shot, no. Nixon won the majority, and not once but twice, and was undermined at every step of the way. And in some respects, so was LBJ. He was installed as president after shenanigans in Chicago. And I think it was more than just Chicago, by the way. I also think... I heard stories about Pennsylvania as well, where 20% of the ballots made it to the furnace on time. But that is how it goes. There is such many issues and many problems because we keep assigning everything to someone else and then accepting what we know to be wrong because we don't want to make waves. And I know in America, particularly when it comes to politics, there is still a huge association, shall we say, with people with particularly with unions and broken noses. And we all know the problem, we all speak about the problem, but we can't speak about it on platforms anymore. You get into trouble. But I am telling you, it's not one group. It is a basically 5-pronged approach of... So, you want the problem? BRICS. And one other country. Well, 3 other countries. So, the majority of the world's problems come from foreign interference to demoralise, destabilise the West, the neo-colonial power of India, who wants to shift wealth and power to them through mass migration. Right, it's the banking cartels, which are made up of China. You know, half the bankers in the world are Chinese, don't you? There's more Chinese banks than any other bank in the world, right? For a while, the Japanese used to be the majority of bankers, but that shifted because America fundamentally screwed Japan over in the 90s. Well, it started in the 80s, but Japan was robust then. But they had a trade imbalance, and instead of addressing the trade imbalance fairly, they took the Americans' advice and destroyed their own economy for the next 20 years. Unable to pull out of the nosedive because the Americans they didn't know how to address stop the bleeding of investors as they pulled out. This is the problem when you make your own citizens poor. You can't rely on them economically to... So, yeah, when you're totally geared towards exports, like China, you create poverty. And the same in Japan, the same in Korea. The West is deliberately creating, not just the West, BRICS is also, the whole world deliberately creates poverty. Now, yeah, there's an attitude amongst the elites. Oh, we could just replace everyone with robots and the society would be so clean. And the woman who was the architect of this realizes how anti-human it was. She left the Social Democrats. That's why you never hear from her again. And she travels the world and trying to give lectures on humanization. I'm trying to find her name and look up to actually what she's up to lately, because I heard she's also given up on that. She's only given a few interviews since leaving, I think it was Sweden and the WEF. So we do know, within and without, there are people, and this is why we're getting there, to why people say they hate feminists. And you shouldn't hate feminists. I come across a lot of people who say they are feminists and they're quite likeable. But see, their definition of feminist doesn't match what most people think a feminist is. And there are people who want to, and we are in a process now where we're seeing a new wave of feminists, and we're seeing a split for the first time. We don't see a collective in feminism anymore. They keep talking about unity. I think a universal brotherhood is just the fundamentals as taught, that you can treat each other with respect without forcing your beliefs onto everybody. But liberalism, it wants to be both the state religion and the state politic. Because really, what's the difference between politics and religion? Religion has worship. Well, liberals worship the state, do they not? They worship the collective, and they believe the human is the highest achievement and therefore should be worshipped. And that's where you get many religions, false cults. False religions. I mean cults of personality, whether it be about a single man, his book, whether it be about a single desert warlord and his book, or a certain religious figure from America and his book. You start to see a pattern where a certain Chinese figure in his book, and well, that's actually a few Chinese cults and a few Indian cults, and it's always a man in his book. So, yeah. And a lot of people go, wow, yeah, there's a lot of men in his books, religions. And they go, well, what about Christ? Well, Christ never sold you a book, or professed to sell you a book to start with. And it wasn't about him. It was about him leading you back to God. And I think there's fundamental problems in society today because we've institutionalized religion to ceremonial practices and false indoctrinations. Now, churches should be voluntary. And we've seen what's happened when Islam becomes voluntary. We have 40,000 just the other day in Pakistan leave one of their largest mosques overnight. Now, Pakistan has mosques with hundreds of thousands of attendees because they go all the time, day in, day out. They're cycled through like sheep. But yeah, more and more people, because they move further and further away from the cities as far as they can, try to return to the countryside, try to eke out a living in what's left. Because half of Pakistan's empty because of massive urbanisation. But that massive urbanisation's led to massive unemployment and systemic collapses. Again, when a country's sole focus is religion and preparing you for death, there's no incentive to live or produce or acceptance of art and other cultures. Because we do have this problem amongst men of not accepting other cultures. And this is where we get to the one-size model fits all. The West is trying to create this liberal man, just like the Soviet Union tried to create the Soviet man. Again, why we must outlaw cultural Marxism. It's antithetical to freedom. You can't. It's the paradox, right? It's the paradox question. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? And then when someone says, well, the universe has always existed. At some point, there was no beginning, and there will be no end. Just stages. And whether this Earth, we don't know exactly when, light and how life formed or whatever. No one can agree. So we shouldn't make it a fundamental. We can accept it. We accept every theory until we have proof, right? And that's the problem. Again, the liberals want to create a one-size-fits-all model and force that down your throat. And every time they keep coming up with paradoxes or they just ignore them, every time they find that the Bible has truth, they ignore it. So, remember, the evolutionists tried to disprove the Bible and they ended up proving the Bible. And there are many speakers out there who can tell this story better than I can. But ultimately, it comes down to the fact that once that occurred, this is where the cultural Marxists in Britain decided to fundamentally destroy the West because Western man was no longer ideal. Remember, liberalism is a religion about idealism, and that's why they destroy men, because they want you to be broken down like Ted Zelinsky, except their intention with Ted Zelinsky was to turn him into the ideal man. And that's the problem, is their ideal man is what they call the Renaissance man, is both a feminist and yet at the same time a physical specimen for women's pleasure. A man with no rights, a man with no goals, a man with no achievements, a property of the state. And that's why they wanted to destroy factory working in the West. Just get rid of all the labour jobs because that heightened aggression, physicality, except for, of course, the gym bros, yes, and sports. So you can start to see why there's systemic abuse against men, because they have a political goal, which we collectively never voted on, and most of us, most of us were going to say, well, what happens after our sporting career? Well, that's where the lucky few get the high-paying jobs, and so the whole system is based on systemic failure, systemic abuse, systemic oppression, all because the elites know that if there's a middle class, that's wealth they don't have. That's why they destroy, that's why they want to tax wealth, to destroy what's left in the middle class, so you can't have generational wealth like the elites. Because the elites are not American citizens. They're not citizens of Australia. They're residents. And most of their income isn't earned in the West, so they don't even pay the taxes. Right now, I'll tell you a story, which you may not believe. Iran hates you. Allegedly. No. That hate is an internal, not an external hate. The internal hate America. In other words, don't leave Iran. Don't leave. America dominates the world. So we're protecting you from the boogeyman. Yet every Iranian, from the Ayatollah Khomeini, General Soleimani, and many others, they all put their children in the West, and then they engage in systemic blackmail. Right? This is the terrorism grift. Ever since the creation of Israel, there's been systemic terrorism against the West. Why? Blackmail. If you can afford to build Israel, you can afford to build our nations. Jordan and all the others, that's why they attacked Israel, because we wouldn't come in and build their nations as well. Now, we had built Lebanon, but they destroyed the Syrian refugees and the Palestinian refugees, fighting over the small population, which was less than 1 million. There's less than 1 million Lebanese, but why has Lebanon got a large population? All the Syrians and all the Palestinians. Now, only half the Jewish population moved to Israel. The others were split between Iran and Syria. And now you have a split in the Jewish world. And it goes on and on. There's splits in the Christian world and that. But fundamentally, the abuse of men by politicians since the end of World War II has been worse than World War II. We've seen more men die, not less, because the states are obsessed with power over each other. So you have Iran sending its elite kids to live and work and educate in America and to make money in America, as long as they send half home. Not to the state, to their parents, of course. So you have a fundamental systemic abuse on many levels across the world that the West won't address, because bankers sit there and go, war is big business, it's borrowing money. Pension funds, pension funds, we take all your wealth, we might get ourselves rich, we get all the assets, and we dole you out small percentages of the profits. Terrorism. Well, we just get rid of the undesirables. So we have many male systemic abuse. It comes back to the lack of education, the lack of achievements, goals. We have kids who could possibly be way better, right, based on tests, particularly in college, of what they call the underperformance factor. And that is, if you don't get kids between 7 and 14 to learn to educate themselves, it takes them years, and you end up with tens of thousands of people every year getting degrees they don't need, because again, it's all about systemic abuse, all about creating wealth for the few. Right, the majority don't need college. The majority of jobs do not need a college education. The majority of companies only need one engineer, not 10. Like, they found this with, a lot of your aircraft were designed by people who flew them and built them, not people who went to college. They thought later they could pass on their knowledge to many and this again with the whole idea of mass production. But you look around, the world only needs a few thousand aircraft. So that's why we have systemic abuse, folks, is money men. No, I'm sorry. And of course, what happens? They're feminists. They give all their wealth to a woman. The majority of millionaires and billionaires are matriarchal families. Kennedys, Roosevelts, some of the richest in the world, set on huge fortunes, and they are trying to pull up the ladder. And if we don't fix it, we'll only see the next generation Z, get wilder and wilder and more against us. If we don't side with them, they will turn against us, just like how boomers abandoned Generation X. Briefly touched on Generation Y before focusing on their Generation Z, millennials. So, yeah. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, subscribe. Please support the channel. You support me on Patreon, Ko-Fi, buy my books, buy my merch. I appreciate each and every one of you. See you in the next video, and bye for now.